Emily adjusted her backpack and glanced at the GPS, the weak signal flickering as they moved deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow denser with each step, towering over them like silent sentinels, and the sun dipped lower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the narrow trail. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness that made each of them uneasy, though no one wanted to admit it. She glanced over her shoulder at the others. Jake, always the bravest and most adventurous of them, strode confidently, laughing and cracking jokes to keep their spirits high. Sam, however, looked tense, his eyes darting around the forest as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. And Lisa, normally quiet but steady, kept her head down, focused, avoiding eye contact as if sensing something none of them could. "I told you, it's just a bunch of old legends," Jake called back to them. "Graywood Village is nothing more than an abandoned dump. People just made up those stories to keep kids from messing around here. Or maybe there's more to it than that," Lisa muttered, barely loud enough to hear. "Oh, come on," Jake scoffed. "You don't actually believe that stuff, do you?" "I don't know," Lisa replied, shrugging. "But the village has been abandoned for nearly 50 years, and nobody seems to know why. That's strange enough for me." Emily looked at Lisa and nodded. The stories surrounding Graywood Village had haunted their town for years. They'd all grown up hearing about it, how one winter's night in 1973 the entire village had disappeared. Houses were left untouched, food remained on tables, but there wasn't a single soul left to tell what had happened. Since then, Graywood had been a ghost town, swallowed by the forest, known only through whispered rumors and the occasional brave soul who claimed to have seen strange lights or heard unearthly sounds from the woods around it. "It's not just the stories," Sam said, his voice a whisper. "My uncle went up here when he was a kid, dared by some friends. He swore he heard voices calling his name from the trees. He was terrified." "Probably just the wind," Jake said, rolling his eyes. "Look, we're going to get there, take some creepy photos, maybe camp out in one of the houses, and then we can all laugh about it in the morning." Emily tried to laugh along, but something about the atmosphere made her feel on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. As they moved deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of nature fell silent. There were no birds, no rustling animals, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. The path twisted and turned, and with each step, the fog grew thicker, curling around them in wispy tendrils. It was as if the forest was alive, breathing, waiting. Emily kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the line of trees. But there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the creeping fog. "Hey, did you guys hear that?" Lisa whispered, stopping suddenly. The group fell silent, straining their ears. At first, there was only the silence. Then, faintly, there it was, a whisper barely perceptible, as though carried on a distant breeze. "Emily!" Emily froze. The voice had said her name. Her friends exchanged nervous glances, each one looking around as though expecting to see someone else among them. "Probably just the wind," Jake repeated, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. "Right," Emily said, forcing a laugh. "Just the wind. Or maybe one of you playing a trick on me." No one answered, and the tension thickened. After a moment they continued walking, but now there was a quiet dread in the air, and no one spoke. The fog grew denser, swirling around their ankles like smoke, and the trees seemed to close in tighter, forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out the last traces of sunlight. Emily's skin prickled as they reached a small clearing where the forest parted just enough to reveal the first signs of Graywood Village. The fog receded slightly, giving them a view of broken rooftops and shattered windows, like a skeletal hand reaching up from the earth. The houses looked as though they'd been abandoned mid-breath, frozen in time yet somehow decaying with each passing second. "There it is," Jake said, though his voice was much quieter now. The village stood before them, silent and foreboding. The houses were small, huddled close together, with peeling paint and boarded windows. Ivy and other creeping plants had swallowed some of the buildings, as if the forest itself was reclaiming the village. An old wooden sign, barely readable through the dirt and moss, hung at a crooked angle, reading "Welcome to Graywood." "Home sweet home," Jake joked, trying to lighten the mood, but no one laughed. Emily took a hesitant step forward, feeling as if she were crossing an invisible line, a point of no return. Her friends followed, their footsteps eerily quiet on the damp ground. Every sound seemed amplified, from the rustle of leaves to the occasional drip of water from the broken gutters of the houses. "Look at this place," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like they just left everything and never came back." They passed by houses with broken windows, some with chairs tipped over on the porches, as though the occupants had left in a hurry. One house had a tricycle lying on its side, its rusted handlebars twisted. Another had an open door, leading into darkness. The silence was almost unbearable, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Emily glanced at the others, wondering if they felt it too, the feeling that they were being watched, that 100 unseen eyes were tracking their every move. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that it was just a story, just an abandoned village. But the sensation wouldn't go away. As they reached the center of the village, they noticed an old church looming over them, its steeple broken and crooked, casting an ominous shadow. The doors hung open slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness within. Something about it felt wrong, as though the building itself was alive, aware of their presence. "We should go in there," Jake said, though he didn't sound as sure of himself as before. "Are you serious?" Lisa asked, glancing nervously at the church. "That place looks haunted. Isn't that why we came here?" Jake replied, forcing a grin. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Emily looked at the others, hesitating. Every instinct screamed for her to turn around, to leave this place and never look back. But something in the air, some intangible force, seemed to draw them closer to the church, as though it were calling to them. Reluctantly, they followed Jake, crossing the small square in front of the church. The mist seemed to thicken around them, closing them off from the rest of the village, isolating them in the shadow of the steeple. As they approached the door, Emily heard it again, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Emily!" She stopped, heart pounding. The voice was closer this time, as if someone was standing right beside her, speaking directly into her ear. She turned, but there was no one there, just her friends, each looking as tense and uneasy as she felt. Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. They shook their heads, exchanging nervous glances. Emily forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of her heart. She reminded herself that it was just the wind, or maybe her imagination. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The whisper had been real. As they stepped into the church, the air grew colder, carrying the scent of dust and decay. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by their flashlights, and the faint echo of their footsteps filled the empty space. It was as if they were intruding on something ancient and forbidden. In the darkness, rows of old wooden pews lined the aisle, each seat occupied by a doll. They were dressed in tattered clothes from another era, their faces cracked and faded. Their glassy eyes stared straight ahead, empty and unseeing. But as Emily looked closer, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The dolls were all facing them, and from somewhere deep within the church, she heard the whisper again. Graywood village lay silent and unmoving, shrouded in fog and mystery. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press down on Emily and her friends, making it hard to breathe. Each building stood like a decayed monument to a forgotten past, skeletal remains of homes long deserted, but somehow alive with a sinister energy. It was as if the village itself was watching them, its shadows creeping ever closer, hungry and waiting. "Look at these houses," Sam murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He gazed at the homes lining the narrow street, his expression twisted in discomfort. "It's like they just vanished." Emily followed his gaze, taking in the eerie stillness of the village. The houses, despite their obvious age and neglect, seemed preserved in a way that felt unnatural. Broken windows, doors left ajar, rusted cars parked haphazardly in driveways, all frozen in time. Chairs tipped over as if abandoned mid-sentence, children's toys scattered across yards, remnants of lives suddenly interrupted. Lisa stepped up beside her, crossing her arms as though to protect herself from the chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground. "Why would people just leave everything behind like this?" she asked, almost to herself. "Maybe they were running from something," Sam muttered, his voice laced with unease. "Or maybe it was the curse," Jake said with a smirk, trying to lighten the mood. "Legend has it they performed some kind of ritual here. The whole village was cursed, and everyone just vanished." "Jake, that's not funny," Lisa snapped, glaring at him. "Look around you. This place feels wrong." Jake raised his hands defensively. "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's already thinking. It's creepy, sure, but that's why we came here, right?" Emily stayed quiet, her attention drawn to a narrow alleyway between two houses. The fog pooled thicker there, swirling and twisting in a way that seemed almost alive. She could have sworn she saw a shape moving in the shadows, something small and quick that vanished as soon as she focused on it. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing towards the alley. The others looked, but saw nothing. Jake laughed. "You're starting to sound like a horror movie character, Em. Did you see that?" he mocked, trying to lighten the tension. But as they turned back to the alley, a strange scratching sound echoed from within, like claws scraping against wood. The sound grew louder, closer, and they instinctively stepped back, eyes fixed on the darkness. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed through the alley, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something sickly sweet, almost floral. "Let's keep moving," Emily said, her voice shaky. She didn't want to admit how unnerved she was, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes following her every step. The group moved down the main street of the village, their footsteps echoing in the empty air. Shadows seemed to stretch and contract with every flicker of their flashlights, creating an illusion of movement. They passed more houses, each one appearing more decrepit than the last, yet each filled with odd remnants of lives that had simply stopped. One house caught Emily's attention. It was larger than the others, with peeling white paint and a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. Its windows were boarded up, but the boards seemed to have been nailed hastily, as if done in a hurry. A faint scratching sound, similar to the one from the alley, echoed from inside, and Emily felt an inexplicable urge to go in. "Look," she said, pointing at the house. "This one looks different." Jake glanced at it, nodding. "Wanna check it out?" Lisa and Sam exchanged uneasy looks, but curiosity overpowered their fear, and they all approached the front porch. The creak of the floorboards beneath their feet sounded like a warning, but they pressed on, moving as one into the shadow of the old house. Jake pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a groan, revealing a hallway shrouded in darkness. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the slight draught as they stepped inside. The hallway was lined with photographs, their faces blurred and faded by time, but Emily could just make out the haunting shapes of people standing stiffly, their eyes dark and hollow. Some were family portraits, children clutching the hands of parents, while others showed groups of villagers, all staring blankly ahead. "This is unsettling," Sam whispered, staring at one photo where a woman's face had been scratched out, her body left standing awkwardly beside her family. Emily moved closer to the photograph, reaching out a hand as though to touch it. The air grew colder the closer she got, until a chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder and gasped, spinning around, only to find Jake smirking. "Relax," he said. "You're gonna freak yourself out." "Cut it out, Jake," Lisa hissed, crossing her arms tightly. "We're all a little on edge." They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps muffled on the old carpet. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from somewhere upstairs. The staircase loomed ahead, its steps cracked and sagging under years of neglect. Emily hesitated, but a strange, almost magnetic pull drew her towards it, as though something was waiting for her at the top. "Are we really doing this?" Sam asked, glancing nervously at the staircase. Jake, ever the daredevil, took the first step, his flashlight casting an eerie glow over the walls. "Come on, we've made it this far," he said, his voice filled with false bravado. One by one they followed, their feet creaking on each step as they ascended. The scratching grew louder, now clearly coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Emily's heart pounded as she reached the top, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She felt a strange, inexplicable pull towards the room, a compulsion that she couldn't ignore. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The others nodded, their faces pale and tense. Slowly they approached the door, and Jake, always the bravest, pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, save for an old rocking chair that faced a cracked, dusty window. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. But as they stepped inside, Emily felt a sudden wave of cold wash over her, as though the room itself had drawn a deep, icy breath. "What is this place?" Lisa murmured, her eyes wide with fear. The rocking chair began to move, slowly at first, then faster, as though someone unseen was sitting in it, rocking back and forth. A faint, childlike giggle echoed through the room, and Emily's blood ran cold. She scanned the room, her heart hammering, but saw nothing that could have made the sound. "Let's get out of here," Sam said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Emily's pulse raced, her mind spinning with panic. She reached for the doorknob, twisting and pulling with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. "Jake, help me!" she cried, her voice trembling. Jake joined her, both of them pulling at the door with all their strength, but it remained stubbornly shut, as if held by some invisible force. The laughter echoed again, this time louder, and the air grew colder, almost suffocating. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, his voice filled with desperation. There was no answer, only the soft creak of the rocking chair, moving back and forth in a steady rhythm. Emily felt a chill race down her spine as she realized something was terribly wrong. She looked around the room, searching for any clue, and her eyes fell on a mirror hanging on the opposite wall. In the reflection, she saw something that made her heart stop. A figure stood behind them, a woman with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Her skin was pale and drawn tight over her bones, and her hands were skeletal, reaching out towards them. "Look," Emily whispered, pointing at the mirror. The others turned, their eyes widening in horror as they saw the figure in the reflection. But when they spun around, there was no one there, only the empty room and the ever-creaking rocking chair. The figure in the mirror grinned, her eyes dark and full of malice. She lifted a hand, waving slowly, and Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The figure's mouth moved, though no sound came out, but Emily could read the words as clearly as if they'd been spoken. "Leave, or stay forever." The lights in the room flickered, and the figure vanished from the mirror, leaving only their own pale, terrified reflections. Finally, with one last desperate pull, the door flew open, and they stumbled out, practically tripping over each other in their haste to escape. They raced down the stairs, not daring to look back, and burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever, swirling around them in dense, suffocating waves. The village loomed around them, dark and silent, as if waiting to swallow them whole. What was that? Lisa stammered, clutching her arms as though trying to steady herself. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice shaking. "But I don't think we should stay here." Jake, for once, was silent, his face pale and haunted. Sam nodded, glancing nervously at the surrounding houses, where shadows seemed to move and shift in the fog. But as they started to leave, a low, distant bell began to toll, echoing through the village, each chime sending a wave of dread through them. They exchanged horrified glances, realizing the bell was coming from the old church at the center of the village. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. But even as they moved, Emily felt the village tighten its hold on them, as though it wouldn't let them go without a price. The bell tolled again, its haunting sound echoing through Graywood village, reverberating off the broken walls and abandoned homes, as if the entire village was amplifying the dreadful sound. Emily felt its resonance deep in her chest, each toll a reminder that they were trespassers in a place long forsaken. The old church, dark and foreboding, loomed ahead, its broken steeple reaching like a skeletal hand into the mist-shrouded sky. "I don't think we should go in there," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. She was clutching her arms tightly, casting furtive glances back at the houses as if something might lunge out at them from the shadows. "Do you really think we have a choice?" Jake replied, but there was no confidence in his voice this time. His usual bravado was stripped away, replaced by a look of pure, raw fear. Emily glanced at her friends, feeling the same sense of dread creeping over her. The church seemed to call to them, an irresistible pull, as though something inside knew they were here. It felt alive, breathing, and waiting for them to cross its threshold. With a deep breath, she took the first step forward. The others followed reluctantly, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led up to the church doors. The mist thickened as they approached, swirling around them, muting the sounds of the village until only the low, ominous tolling of the bell filled the air. The wooden doors of the church were slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. As Emily pushed them open, a wave of cold air rushed out, as if they had disturbed something dormant, something that had been waiting a long, long time. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, a sharp contrast to the biting chill outside. The church was cloaked in shadows, and the only light came from their flashlights, casting eerie, flickering beams across the walls. They stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. The interior was lined with rows of wooden pews, each one occupied by a doll. The dolls were ancient, their clothing tattered and faded, their glassy eyes staring blankly ahead, unseeing yet somehow aware. Each one was different, dressed in early 20th century clothing, some with lace collars and bonnets, others in tiny suits. The way they were positioned, stiff and upright, gave the impression of an audience waiting for something to begin. What is this?" Sam stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He edged closer to Emily, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the dolls. Emily shook her head, unable to tear her gaze away from the haunting display. "I don't know. It's like they're watching us." Lisa swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room. Who would do something like this? "Maybe it's some kind of memorial," Emily suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. The doll's empty eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, and she could almost swear she saw one of them turn slightly, its head angled just enough to track their movements. "Why would anyone create this?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Who were these people? As they moved deeper into the church, Jake noticed a large, dusty book lying open on the pulpit at the front of the room. Its pages were yellowed with age, and strange symbols were scrawled across the text in faded ink. He stepped up to it, running a finger over the symbols. "Guys, look at this," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The others joined him, staring down at the book. The text was written in an unfamiliar language, the symbols twisting and looping in ways that made them almost painful to look at. "What language is that?" Sam asked, squinting at the page. "I don't know," Jake replied. "But look here." He pointed to a page near the middle of the book, where a crudely drawn map of the village was sketched in the margins. Symbols were scattered around it, each one positioned at different points on the map. "These look like rituals." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She leaned in closer, studying the map and the symbols. "It's like some kind of guide. Maybe instructions for something." "What kind of rituals, though?" Lisa asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jake flipped the page, revealing a list of names, each one followed by a date. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine as she scanned the names. They were all villagers, she realized, people who had lived in Graywood before it was abandoned. Each name was followed by a single word, scratched in dark, angry ink: sacrificed. "They were sacrifices," Emily murmured, her voice shaking. "Each one of them." Lisa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But sacrificed for what?" "Maybe that's why they all vanished," Sam said, a haunted look in his eyes. "They weren't just killed. They were taken." Jake's face turned pale as he scanned the list, each name a testament to the horror that had unfolded here. "This can't be real," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just a story. It has to be." The bell tolled again, louder this time, sending a jolt of fear through them. It echoed off the walls, rattling the stained-glass windows and filling the room with an eerie resonance. The dolls, silent and still, seemed to lean forward slightly, their faces frozen in hollow, lifeless stares. Emily turned her attention to a door at the back of the church, half hidden behind a tattered curtain. Something about it called to her, a magnetic pull that she couldn't ignore. She felt an overwhelming urge to open it, to see what lay beyond. "Emily, what are you doing?" Lisa asked, noticing her drifting toward the door. There's something back here," Emily replied, barely aware of her own voice. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold metal. The others watched in tense silence as she pulled the door open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "Are you serious?" Sam whispered, his voice filled with dread. "You're not really going down there, are you?" Emily hesitated, a voice in the back of her mind urging her to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But curiosity, or perhaps something stronger, compelled her forward. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair, feeling the wood creak beneath her weight. The others followed, reluctantly, their flashlights casting eerie shadows along the stone walls as they descended. The air grew colder with each step, thick with a damp, earthy smell that hinted at something long buried, something waiting to be uncovered. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange, archaic objects: bones, jars filled with dark liquids, and trinkets that looked as though they had been taken from graves. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried stains that looked alarmingly like blood. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. What is this place?" "It's an altar," Jake replied, his voice hollow. "A place for sacrifices." Emily felt her heart race as she looked around the room, her gaze falling on a series of symbols carved into the walls. They matched the ones in the book, strange and twisted, each one seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. She stepped closer, feeling an inexplicable urge to reach out and touch them. "Emily, don't," Sam said, grabbing her arm. "This place, it's evil." "I know," Emily replied, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the symbols. She felt a strange, almost hypnotic pull towards them, as though they were calling to her, urging her to complete whatever dark ritual had begun here so many years ago. The bell tolled again, louder and closer, as if it were ringing from just outside the door. The ground seemed to tremble with each chime, and the candles on the shelves flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Suddenly, Emily felt a sharp pain in her head, a blinding, searing pain that made her stumble. Images flashed through her mind, fragmented and chaotic. Faces of the villagers, twisted in fear, their eyes wide with terror as they were dragged to this very altar. She saw hands bound, struggling, and a figure cloaked in shadows, chanting in an ancient, guttural language as a knife was raised. "Emily, are you okay?" Lisa's voice cut through the visions, grounding her. Emily shook her head, trying to clear the images from her mind. I saw something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The villagers. They were brought here, forced to participate in some kind of ritual." Jake stepped back, looking around the chamber with a growing sense of horror. This wasn't just some village. It was a cult. The others stared at him, the weight of his words settling over them like a suffocating shroud. The village hadn't been abandoned. It had been destroyed, consumed by a dark force that demanded sacrifice, that thrived on the fear and suffering of those who lived here. "We need to leave," Sam said, his voice frantic. "We need to get out of here now." As they turned to leave, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. The bell tolled again, louder and more insistent, each chime sending a wave of dread through them. Emily's heart raced as she fumbled for the door, her fingers brushing against cold stone. "It's locked," she whispered, panic lacing her voice. "We're trapped." The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift, taking on strange shapes that twisted and writhed along the walls. A low, guttural chant filled the room, echoing off the stone walls, a language they couldn't understand but somehow knew was ancient, filled with malice. A figure appeared at the altar, a shadowy form that seemed to coalesce from the darkness itself. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, and its hands were skeletal, reaching out towards them. "Leave, or become one of us," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow, filled with a bone-chilling finality. Emily backed away, her breath coming in short gasps as she felt her body grow numb. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadow moved closer, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. "You have disturbed the ritual," it said, its voice growing louder, filling the chamber with an unholy resonance. "You must finish what we began." The bell tolled again, and the walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out like hands, reaching for them, pulling them towards the altar. The floor trembled beneath them, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay and rot. In a final act of desperation, Emily grabbed the nearest candle and held it out, the tiny flame flickering in the darkness. She thrust it towards the shadow, and for a moment the figure hesitated, recoiling from the light. "Run!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking through the silence. The others didn't hesitate. They bolted for the stairs, pounding up them as the chanting grew louder, filling the church with an oppressive, suffocating force. They reached the top, throwing themselves against the door, which miraculously swung open, and they stumbled out into the cold night air. They didn't look back as they ran from the church, the bells tolling fading into the distance, replaced by a chorus of whispers that followed them through the fog. The fog seemed to thicken into an almost palpable darkness as they fled the church, each step away from the cursed building bringing no relief. The village lay suffused with an eerie silence, punctuated only by their heavy breathing and the distant, mocking peal of the church bell that echoed like a sinister reminder in their ears. Emily's mind raced as she ran, the horrific images from the altar room still burning in her memory. The feeling of being watched, hunted, hadn't left her. It clung like a shadow, cold and persistent. "This way," she gasped, veering towards what looked like an old schoolhouse, its windows boarded and the door hanging off its hinges. The need for a temporary refuge to gather their thoughts and decide on a plan was desperate. They scrambled inside, the building groaning ominously under the weight of years and neglect. Jake slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he tried to wedge it closed with a broken piece of furniture. The dim light from their flashlights swept over old desks covered in dust and cobwebs, revealing faded children's drawings still pinned to the crumbling walls. "We need to figure out what's going on," Jake said, his voice a rough whisper, strained with fear and disbelief. All of this can't be real." "But it is," Sam replied grimly, checking his phone only to find no signal. "Something very real and very dark is happening here, and now we're part of it." Lisa hugged herself, rubbing her arms vigorously as if to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Those names, the sacrifices. It's like this whole village was some sort of cult, using the church as a front. Emily nodded, her thoughts racing. "And whatever ritual they were performing, it's not finished. That shadow. It said we disturbed it. It wants us to complete it. But how? And why us?" Sam asked, frustration coloring his tone. He paced the small space, his flashlight beam darting around, casting grotesque shadows. Lisa stopped him with a touch on his arm. "Remember the book, the map and the symbols? Maybe there's a clue there, something about how to end this. We have to go back there." Jake's voice cracked slightly, the fear he'd been trying to mask surfacing clearly in his eyes. "No," Emily said, her voice firm despite her pounding heart. "We need to find another way. There has to be some sort of counter-ritual, something to break the cycle. Maybe there's something in the village records, in someone's home." A plan began to form, desperate but necessary. They would split up, search the homes they could safely access for any kind of information about the village, its people, and any rituals they might have practiced. "We meet back here in 30 minutes, no matter what," Emily instructed, trying to infuse her voice with more confidence than she felt. Jake and Lisa paired off to explore the houses on the north side of the street, while Emily and Sam took the south. As they left the relative safety of the schoolhouse, the fog seemed to close in around them, as if trying to smother their efforts. Emily and Sam entered the first house, a small, run-down cottage that reeked of mold and decay. They split up, Sam taking the upstairs while Emily investigated the ground floor. Her flashlight illuminated old family photos on the walls, the faces scratched out, leaving ghostly, unidentifiable figures. In the kitchen, she found a stack of newspapers dating back decades, the headlines speaking of local gatherings and community events that seemed innocuously normal. Digging deeper, she uncovered a loose floorboard and, beneath it, a small box filled with letters. Each letter was written in a trembling hand, detailing fear and suspicion towards the church and its leaders. The most recent letters spoke of plans to confront the leaders, to expose the truth behind the disappearances and the feared rituals. Meanwhile, Sam searched the upper floor, where he found a hidden compartment behind a false wall in the closet of what appeared to have been a child's room. Inside were journals, the writings of a villager who had been suspicious of the church's activities. The journal entries detailed observations, fears, and a mention of a hidden place in the forest where forbidden items were kept, possibly including objects used in the rituals. Reuniting outside, Emily and Sam shared their findings, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture of a village ensnared by dark practices, led by a church whose reach seemed to extend beyond the grave. They heard a shout from across the village. It was Jake, calling for them urgently. Racing over, they found Jake and Lisa standing outside the old post office, a building they hadn't considered searching. Inside, Lisa had found a cache of unopened mail, letters that had never been sent or received, including one that contained a detailed confession from the church's last known leader. The letter was a desperate, guilt-ridden admission that detailed the full scope of the ritual, its purpose to bring about a supposed divine power that instead unleashed something much darker, something that couldn't be controlled. It also mentioned a specific location in the woods, marked with an ancient stone, where the ritual could be reversed. "We need to find that stone," Emily said, her decision made. "It's our best chance." As they prepared to leave, the air grew colder, and a low, mournful moan echoed through the village. The fog swirled more aggressively, as if angered by their newfound resolve. The group felt a palpable sense of urgency, knowing that whatever awaited them at that stone, it was their only chance to end the nightmare. Their flashlights flickered as they set out towards the woods, the darkness ahead seeming to devour the light. Each step took them deeper into the heart of the mystery that had claimed Graywood village, and possibly might claim them as well. The path leading into the forest was choked with overgrowth and tangled roots that seemed to grasp at their feet as they walked. The deeper they ventured, the more the oppressive fog seemed to tighten its grip around them, dampening sounds and dimming their flashlights to mere halos in the gloom. With each step, the sense of foreboding grew, a silent chorus whispering warnings with every rustle of the leaves. Emily led the way, clutching the old map they had found in the post office. The map was cryptic, with ancient symbols and a path marked through the forest leading to a clearing where the stone was supposedly located. According to the confession letter, the stone was an ancient artifact, used long before the village was founded, possibly the cornerstone of all the dark rituals performed by the cult. As they navigated the path, Jake muttered uneasily under his breath, "This fog is unnatural. It's like it's alive, watching us, trying to confuse us." "You're not wrong," Lisa agreed, her voice low. "I can feel it pressing in, almost smothering. Keep an eye on your surroundings. It could be trying to lead us astray." Sam, who had been keeping close to Emily, suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked, tilting his head as if trying to catch a faint sound. They all paused, holding their breath. At first, there was nothing but the soft whisper of the forest. Then, distantly, the sound came again, a low, mournful wail that rose and fell with the wind, sending shivers down their spines. "It's just the wind," Emily reassured, though her voice faltered. "Let's keep moving." The group pressed on, but the eerie sounds did not cease. Instead, they seemed to follow them, growing louder, more desperate. It was as if the forest itself was mourning, or perhaps warning them of the grim fate that awaited should they continue. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and they found themselves on the edge of a clearing. In the center stood the ancient stone, its surface rough and covered with moss and creeping vines. It was taller than a man and carved with more of the same strange symbols they had seen in the church and on the map. The area around the stone was oddly free of fog, as if the artifact itself repelled the oppressive mist. "This is it," Emily said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "This is where we need to perform the reversal ritual." They approached the stone cautiously, their lights playing over the symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. Lisa, who had taken an interest in the symbols back at the church, began to examine them closely. "These are not just random markings. They're a language, a very old one. This might tell us how to stop this." While Lisa studied the symbols, Sam and Jake began to gather materials from around the clearing. According to the letter, the ritual required elements from the forest itself, stones, branches, and water from a nearby stream. As they prepared, Emily took out the confession letter and read over the instructions again. Her hands trembled as she translated what she could, piecing together the process. "It says here we need to form a circle around the stone and offer a token of the living world to the dead. It's supposed to symbolize the balance between life and death, something the original ritual disrupted." "What kind of token?" Jake asked, returning with his arms full of branches. "Something personal, something that means a lot to us," Emily replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photo of her family, her fingers brushing over their faces. "This is mine. It's supposed to represent what I want to protect, what I want to return to." One by one, they placed their items in the circle. Lisa a cherished necklace, Sam a handwritten note from his brother, and Jake a lucky coin he had carried since childhood. They joined hands, forming a chain around the stone, their eyes fixed on the tokens as Emily began to recite the words from the letter. As she spoke, the wind picked up, howling through the clearing, whipping their hair and clothes. The symbols on the stone glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows on their faces. Emily's voice grew louder, more confident with each word, even as the forest seemed to respond with groans and whispers. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a brilliant light burst from the stone, enveloping them in a warm, golden glow. The oppressive atmosphere lifted instantly, as if a weight had been removed from their shoulders. The fog began to dissipate, retreating back into the depths of the forest like a tide going out. For a moment, everything was silent except for their heavy breathing. Then, the light faded, leaving them in darkness once again, save for the soft glow of their flashlights. "We did it," Lisa whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually did it." But before they could celebrate, a sharp, piercing scream cut through the night, coming from the direction of the village. They exchanged frightened glances. "It's not over," Sam said, his face set in grim determination. "We need to get back to the village. Now." As they hurried back through the forest, the path now clear of fog and their way lit by the moonlight that once again pierced through the canopy, they felt a new sense of urgency. Whatever they had unleashed, whatever balance they had attempted to restore, had stirred something else, something that was not ready to let go of Graywood village. The scream that had torn through the quiet night echoed in their minds as they rushed back toward the village. The forest, now less oppressive without the fog, seemed to guide them swiftly on their path. The moon, full and bright, cast eerie shadows that danced around them, giving the woods an almost ethereal quality. Despite the beauty, the urgency was palpable. Each snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. As they neared the edge of the village, the scream came again, closer this time, more desperate. It was a sound that chilled the blood, a sound of terror and pain that none of them could ignore. Emily's heart raced as they paused at the tree line, the familiar silhouettes of the abandoned houses casting long, dark shadows across the ground. "Do you think it's a trap?" Jake whispered, his eyes scanning the dark windows of the nearest homes. "It might be," Sam replied, his voice tense. "But we can't just ignore it. We have to check it out." They moved cautiously, entering the village with a sense of foreboding. The houses seemed different now, as if the absence of the fog had stripped away some malevolent veil, revealing a more somber reality of decay and abandonment. The scream came again, leading them toward the old church where their ordeal had begun. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken steeple pointing jaggedly at the sky like an accusation. They approached slowly, flashlights sweeping the area. As they reached the door, it swung open silently, an invitation or perhaps a challenge. They stepped inside, their lights piercing the darkness. The interior was just as they remembered, the pews lined with dolls, their glassy eyes reflecting the light in a macabre tableau. The scream had not come from the church, though. It was outside, in the back, where a small graveyard lay hidden beneath overgrown weeds and twisted vines. They made their way through the back door, their footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The graveyard was chaotic, tombstones tilted at odd angles, inscriptions worn away by time. The screaming had stopped now, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to weigh on their shoulders. They spread out, searching among the graves. Sam, moving towards the far end of the graveyard, stumbled upon a freshly dug grave. The earth was loose, the soil turned over recently. His flashlight beam caught something at the bottom of the pit, a hand, pale and still, reaching up through the dirt. "Over here!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. They rushed over, dropping to their knees to dig with their hands. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to their fingers as they unearthed the person buried below. It was a woman, her eyes wide open in terror, her mouth filled with dirt. She was alive but barely, her breaths shallow and ragged. Emily and Lisa gently lifted her out, brushing the dirt from her face. She coughed violently, gasping for air, her body trembling. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice soft, trying to calm the woman. "My name is," and she rasped, her voice hoarse. I was hiding. They thought I was dead, but I hid. When everyone disappeared." "You've been here all this time?" Jake asked, incredulous, and nodded weakly. "Hiding. In the woods, in the houses. I watched them, the ones that took everyone. I saw what they did here, in the church. What happened? Why did they take the villagers?" Lisa questioned, her tone urgent, and closed her eyes, the memories clearly painful. It was a cult. They believed they could bring about a new world. But they needed sacrifices, a bridge to the other side. They used the villagers, one by one. When they tried to use me, I escaped, and they thought I was dead. "But we stopped it, the ritual," Emily said. "We performed the reversal," and shook her head slowly. "You may have stopped them, but the spirit they called, it's still here. You unleashed it when you broke the ritual." The gravity of her words settled on them like a cold shroud. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine, realizing the true depth of their situation. "What do we do now?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You must finish it," and said, "Seal it away." The original cult leader, he had a book. It contains the way to seal the spirit. It should be in the church, hidden. They helped and to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back to the church. Inside, they searched frantically, moving aside the altar to reveal a hidden compartment below. Inside was an old leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked. Opening the book, they found instructions for a sealing ritual, more complex and demanding than the reversal they had performed. It required them to harness the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, binding them to the stone in the forest clearing. "We need to do this now," Emily said, her resolve hardening, "before it grows stronger." They gathered the necessary materials from around the village and returned to the stone clearing. With Anne's guidance, they arranged the elements around the stone, each taking a position at one of the cardinal points. The ritual was intense, each word and action fraught with urgency. As they chanted the ancient words, the air grew thick, the wind whipping around them in a frenzied dance. Fire flared high, water churned, and the earth beneath their feet trembled. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The wind died down, the fire reduced to embers, the earth still once more. The oppressive presence that had haunted the village felt lifted, a peace settling over the area for the first time in decades. Exhausted but relieved, they looked at each other, knowing they had faced something unimaginable and come out alive. They helped and out of the clearing, planning to take her back to civilization, to a world that had forgotten Graywood village. As they left the clearing, the first rays of dawn lit the sky, casting a soft, warm glow over the village. Graywood, once a place of nightmares, now lay quiet and still, its dark legacy finally at rest. As they walked, Emily looked back once, seeing the village bathed in the light of a new day. A sense of closure, of finality, filled her. A chapter ended in the long, troubled history of Graywood village. But in her heart she knew some stories, some places, held echoes that never fully fade, whispers of the past that would linger in the shadows, always waiting, always remembering.